Welcome the anointed ones. The moment people realize you can't be controlled, they don't get quiet. They get sloppy. There's a strange pattern that repeats itself every single time someone uncovers the truth about you. Not admiration, not understanding, not even confrontation. What follows is emotional chaos, sudden outbursts, side arguments, misplaced anger, people snapping on the wrong person, burning bridges they still needed, and crashing relationships they swore they had under control. All because one unsettling realization hit them at once. You are not who they thought you were, and you never were. Here's a fact most people don't talk about, because it exposes too much. Human beings don't spiral when they lose you. They spiral when they lose leverage over you. Studies in behavioral psychology show that when control is removed unexpectedly, the brain shifts into threat mode. Judgment drops, emotional regulation collapses, and impulse takes the wheel. That's why when the truth about you finally surfaces, they don't confront you. They explode on somebody else, somebody safer, somebody closer, somebody who didn't even know they were about to catch emotional shrapnel. What really set them off wasn't your success, your glow, or your growth. It was the quiet confirmation that you were never as dependent as they assumed, that the version of you they tried to manage, minimize, or mold never actually existed. And once that illusion cracked, everything built on it started collapsing at the same time. Friendships, alliances, confidence, even their self-image. You didn't push the dominoes, you simply stopped holding them up. There's a dark comedy to it if you look closely. The same people who swore they had you figured out are now emotionally freelancing, snapping at co-workers, arguing with partners, and self-sabotaging in real time, all while pretending they're completely unbothered. It's almost impressive. Almost. But beneath the chaos is panic, because they've just discovered something irreversible. You don't need to fight them, prove anything, or explain yourself. Your existence alone already disrupted the entire system they thought they were running. And that's where this story begins, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the moment they found out who you really are, and everything started crashing shortly after. Number 1. They didn't discover who you pretend to be. They uncovered who you remain under pressure. What really shook them wasn't your personality, your talent, or the version of you that shows up when life is easy. It was who you stayed when things were ugly, when pressure was constant, when support disappeared, when people expected you to break, bend, or turn bitter. They were watching closely, even when you didn't know it, waiting for cracks, waiting for proof that hardship would rot you from the inside out. And it never did. They saw you take losses without becoming cruel. They saw you get pushed aside without turning desperate. They saw you experience betrayal without becoming reckless or sloppy. That's the part that messed with their head. Most people change when they're squeezed. They start lying, performing, or selling pieces of themselves just to survive. You didn't. You stayed rooted, not perfect, not untouched, but intact. And that kind of consistency under pressure makes people uncomfortable, because it exposes what pressure does to them. They were fine with the idea of you struggling, as long as struggle made you smaller. What they weren't prepared for was struggle sharpening your judgment, strengthening your boundaries, and forcing you to grow a spine. You didn't come out loud or arrogant, you came out clear. Clear about who you are, clear about what you'll tolerate, clear about what you'll never do just to be accepted again. That's when admiration quietly flipped into resentment, because now they couldn't tell themselves you survived by luck, help, or shortcuts. They had to face the truth that your character held when circumstances tried to crush it. And character is the one thing you can't fake, borrow, or steal. Either it's there, or it isn't. This is why they started acting strange, why conversations shifted, why energy changed, why tension appeared where there used to be comfort. You became proof that integrity isn't theoretical. It's something you carry when nobody is clapping, protecting you, or offering reassurance. And once people realize you have that, they don't know how to place you anymore. They wanted a version of you that cracked so they could feel justified in how they treated you. Instead, they found someone who endured without losing themselves. And that discovery didn't inspire them, it exposed them. Number 2, they found out you were never depending on them. You were outgrowing them quietly. The thing that made them lose control wasn't a confrontation, a show of strength, or even a bold move on your part. It was the quiet, unspoken truth they hadn't noticed until it hit them like a slap. You weren't relying on them. Every manipulation, every attempt to control, every subtle way they tried to keep you tethered, failed because you had already built your foundation without them. They assumed you needed their approval, their attention, their guidance. They believed you were waiting for them to open doors, validate decisions, or protect you from consequences. The moment they realized none of that was true, their world tilted. You weren't dependent. You weren't looking over your shoulder, waiting for instructions. You were moving, evolving, and growing on your own, quietly, deliberately, and consistently. Your progress didn't make noise. It didn't seek recognition. It didn't require anyone's blessing. And that's what crushed them. They thought their presence was mandatory in your journey. They thought they held a piece of your trajectory. And discovering that they didn't wasn't just humbling for them, it was terrifying. Because if you could thrive without them, all the control, all the manipulation, all the silent coercion they relied on suddenly became meaningless. They saw you thriving in spaces they couldn't influence. They noticed people respecting you without them. They realized the version of you they thought they knew was already evolving past their reach. That truth doesn't just sting. It rattles the very core of anyone who needs to feel indispensable. You weren't waiting for opportunities to be handed down. You were creating your own. You weren't being shaped by them. You were shaping yourself. And when that truth hit, they didn't confront it rationally. They didn't accept it gracefully. They panicked. They lashed out. They projected frustrations on anyone nearby because they finally understood they weren't controlling your story. They were watching it pass them by. You had outgrown them in silence, and that silent power is more terrifying than any loud confrontation. Number 3, they discovered you weren't reacting because you were calculating, not scared. What threw them completely off balance wasn't that you stayed calm. It wasn't that you held your ground or didn't give them the reaction they expected. The real shock came when they realized that every pause, every measured move, every moment you appeared unbothered wasn't weakness. It was strategy. While they were spinning, shouting, and panicking, you were quietly observing, analyzing, and planning your next steps. That's the kind of clarity that terrifies people who thrive on chaos. They assumed you'd panic, overreact, or make a mistake under pressure. When none of that happened, they didn't just misread you. They underestimated the full extent of your presence and control. They had built a whole narrative in their minds. Provoke, intimidate, confuse, and eventually you would break. What they didn't account for was your patience, your discipline, and your ability to detach just enough to think clearly. Every comment they threw, every attempt to manipulate, every subtle jab intended to rattle you only gave you more insight. You weren't frozen. You weren't confused. You weren't scared. You were watching. You were noting weaknesses. You were understanding intentions. You were preparing yourself to act when the timing was undeniable. That realization, when it hit them, caused pure panic. They thought their energy, their intimidation, their chaos had an effect. But instead of bending you, it exposed how predictable they were. Their overreactions became their own undoing. and your calm became a mirror reflecting their instability. That's why they started lashing out at others, why their control faltered, why the cracks in their plans began showing everywhere. The truth they couldn't swallow is simple. Your composure was never about them. It was about your next move, your security, your growth. And in seeing that, they lost more than control. They lost the illusion that they could ever catch you off guard. They discovered that reacting isn't strength, calculating is. And once that clicked, their meltdown was inevitable. Number 4. They realized their narrative about you stopped working on other people. The moment that hit them hardest wasn't when you confronted them or exposed them directly. It was when their carefully crafted story about you, the lies, the exaggerations, the manipulations, stopped landing. People they had influenced or intimidated suddenly started questioning, noticing inconsistencies, and seeing through the version of you they tried to sell. Their control, which relied on shaping how others perceived you, crumbled. The panic wasn't just about losing face, it was about losing authority, influence, and the false sense that they could manipulate reality itself. They had spent so long constructing a narrative that painted you as weak, flawed, or dependent. They assumed others would swallow it without hesitation. But truth has a way of exposing its own power. Once people around them started recognizing the real you, independent, grounded, resilient, and capable, it created a ripple effect. Suddenly, their evidence and claims no longer made sense. They looked irrational, they sounded desperate, and worse, they could see it happening in real time. That's when the meltdown started. They began to lash out, not at you, but at anyone within reach. Friends, colleagues, casual acquaintances, anyone who could act as a mirror for their failing narrative became a target. Their insecurities magnified, their words lost precision, and their authority evaporated. They couldn't contain it, because the very foundation of their control, the story they told, was collapsing. The terrifying part for them was that you hadn't done anything aggressive. You didn't fight back publicly. You didn't defend yourself with arguments or confrontations. All you did was exist consistently, authentically, and without compromise. That quiet authenticity exposed the fragility of their narrative. And as the realization sank in, their confidence, their composure, and their ability to manipulate dissolved. They were left scrambling, reacting, and crashing, because they finally understood the truth that had been hidden from them. Their version of you no longer mattered to anyone who saw reality clearly. Your integrity and quiet consistency had undone all their effort, and nothing could fix it. Number 5. They found out you were respected in rooms they can't enter. The moment they started losing, it wasn't because you had influence. It was because you had influence in places they couldn't even step into. They had always assumed their proximity to you, their control over the narrative, or their manipulations would define how others saw you. They believed they were the gatekeepers of your reputation. Then reality hit them like a shockwave. People who mattered, people they couldn't sway, people whose opinions actually counted, were noticing your integrity, your wisdom, and your resilience, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. That kind of realization is crushing for anyone who thrives on control. They spent so much energy assuming that your story, your actions, and your worth could be dictated by their perception. They built strategies to undermine you, to poke at insecurities, and to limit your reach. And yet, in spaces they weren't invited to, spaces they couldn't influence, you were quietly being recognized, respected, and even admired. Their panic wasn't just jealousy, it was humiliation. They were witnessing the undeniable proof that their role in your life was never as central as they imagined. The fact that your value exists independently of their input, and that people they can't manipulate see it clearly, completely destabilized them. Suddenly, the rules they relied on didn't apply. The leverage they thought they had evaporated, and the control they assumed they maintained turned out to be a mirage. The rage and confusion that followed were almost theatrical, sniping at others, picking petty fights, and desperately trying to reclaim relevance in situations where they had none. What they failed to understand is that respect and influence aren't granted by proximity or approval. They're earned, quietly, consistently, and authentically. You never needed them to open doors, validate your moves, or defend your reputation. The more they realized this, the more unhinged they became. They weren't just spazzing. They were seeing firsthand that their power had limits, and you were thriving in the spaces where they couldn't touch you. That's why they crashed so hard. Your presence in those unseen rooms wasn't just a testament to your worth. It was a mirror reflecting their irrelevance. Number 6. They discovered you healed without closure, apologies, or permission. What shook them to their core wasn't the fact that you moved on. It was that you did it silently, on your own terms, without needing their approval or even acknowledgement. They assumed that the damage they caused, the manipulations, the betrayals, and the disappointments would leave you stuck, bitter, and looking back. They expected you to need their words, their validation, or some form of apology to feel whole again. Then they realized none of that mattered. You had healed anyway. And that realization didn't just frustrate them, it threw them into a spiral. Your ability to recover quietly, without theatrics, stripped them of the control they thought they had over your narrative. They wanted to see you wounded, stuck, or dependent, because that would validate their sense of importance. Instead, they watched, powerless, as you reclaimed yourself. Every decision you made, every boundary you set, and every moment of composure you displayed was a subtle proof that your growth didn't hinge on them. They couldn't manipulate your emotions, distort your story, or use guilt to bind you because you weren't waiting for permission to exist fully. The panic comes from understanding that you didn't just survive, you evolved. You didn't hold on to anger or resentment as a weapon. You didn't seek revenge as a form of satisfaction. You simply healed and moved forward, letting time and your own strength do the work they assumed only they could control. That kind of autonomy is terrifying to anyone who has relied on fear, guilt, or influence to maintain relevance in someone else's life. And the deeper sting for them is that your healing didn't require acknowledgement. You didn't parade it. You didn't need applause. You simply reclaimed yourself in silence, proving that their absence, their mistakes, and their games were irrelevant to your progress. Witnessing someone thrive despite them, completely untethered and unshaken, is the ultimate disruption. That's why their reactions became chaotic, irrational, and desperate. Your quiet strength exposed their dependency, their insecurity, and their inability to measure someone who doesn't need them to survive. Number 7. They realized you remember everything. You just chose not to weaponize it yet. What shook them the most wasn't that you had memories of every slight, betrayal, and manipulation. It was that you hadn't used them as ammunition. Every insult, every lie, every hidden agenda they thought they buried or erased in time, you carried quietly, like a ledger only you could read. They expected you to react impulsively, to confront, to call them out in the heat of the moment. Instead, you held everything with calm precision, leaving them in a state of growing paranoia, because they could feel the weight of what you remembered, even if you didn't speak it aloud. They started to notice that their past tactics were losing power. Jabs that once rattled you no longer landed. Threats that once controlled your behavior were ignored. And the most unsettling part for them was knowing you were fully aware of the score. Every transaction accounted for in your mind, every betrayal catalogued, every intention recorded. They could feel the tension, the unspoken judgment, the quiet certainty that nothing went unnoticed. That knowledge alone became a weapon, more terrifying than any outburst could ever be, because it meant they could never truly relax around you again. The panic set in slowly but unmistakably. They began to act irrationally, overcompensate, and lash out at anyone within reach. You didn't even need to move. Your restraint, your composure, and your memory did the work for you. They couldn't understand why you weren't retaliating immediately, why you weren't playing the same petty games, and that confusion fueled their meltdown. What they failed to grasp is that remembering everything without using it immediately isn't weakness. It's strategy, it's patience, it's control over the narrative and over yourself. And that control makes them look reckless, desperate, and exposed. The more they realized the depth of your memory, the more insecure and chaotic they became, because your quiet power was not only undeniable, it was inevitable. They weren't just losing their composure. They were facing the undeniable truth that the person they tried to manipulate was leagues ahead, silently calculating and fully aware. Number 8, they found out you don't need revenge because consequences handle that for you. What truly unnerved them wasn't anger, confrontation, or retaliation from your side. It was the quiet, undeniable fact that you didn't need to do anything at all for justice to find its way. Every lie they told, every manipulation, every attempt to undermine you started to circle back in ways they couldn't control. They expected chaos, shouting, or attacks, and instead they were met with calm inevitability. That realization is jarring for anyone who's used to power over others. Suddenly their actions are self-defeating, and you're untouchable without lifting a finger. They had assumed you would respond with fury, because that's what people usually do. They believed emotional reactions were the measure of influence, and that without it, you were vulnerable. But you understood that real power doesn't need to announce itself. You let time, truth, and circumstances do the work. And watching them spiral, overreact, and self-sabotage while you remained untouched was a lesson they never anticipated. Your lack of reaction didn't mean weakness, it meant mastery. You weren't trapped in their chaos, you were observing it, letting it collapse under its own weight. The meltdown began the moment they realized that their schemes were unraveling without you intervening. Every attempt to regain control backfired. Every effort to shame or intimidate only exposed them further. They started lashing out at others, blaming the wrong people, making reckless decisions, all because they were facing consequences they assumed you would have to deliver. But the truth was, consequences had already started acting on autopilot, and you, standing silently above it all, became untouchable evidence that control doesn't always come from aggression. What made it unbearable for them is that revenge requires effort, planning, and energy. You didn't waste yours. You allowed their own actions to dismantle their illusions, exposing their weakness, irrationality, and lack of foresight. That quiet inevitability, that hands-off precision, is the ultimate disruption. And watching them crash while you remain steady is a power so subtle yet devastating it leaves them rattled, panicked, and completely out of their depth. Number 9. They discovered you weren't broken. You were refined. What shook them to their core wasn't your strength or success. It was the realization that every hardship, every betrayal, every moment they thought would shatter you, didn't. Instead of leaving you bitter, angry, or weak, every challenge had sharpened you, clarified your vision, and honed your instincts. They expected cracks, and instead they found edges, a version of you that had been polished by adversity, not crushed by it. That's a truth that rattles anyone who thrives on control or manipulation. You can't intimidate someone whose foundation is built from fire. They had assumed your struggles would make you smaller, more compliant, easier to predict. They counted on bitterness, emotional wounds, or fear to dictate your reactions, to give them leverage. What they didn't see coming was that you were learning, growing, and refining yourself with every single obstacle. Each setback became a lesson, each betrayal a tool for discernment, each disappointment a source of clarity. You weren't just surviving, you were becoming more precise, more self-aware, more untouchable in ways they couldn't understand. That's why their meltdown happened so intensely. They realized that their attempts to break you hadn't succeeded. Instead, they had contributed to your refinement. Every action they thought would weaken you ended up strengthening the very aspects of yourself that made them panic. Their schemes, their manipulation, their control, it all fed into your evolution while leaving them exposed as desperate and powerless. The most terrifying part for them was watching someone rise without revenge, without chaos, without external validation. You didn't need them to repair yourself. You didn't need acknowledgement to feel whole. You didn't need their consent to grow. And that autonomy, that refined strength, made them unpredictable in their response because no amount of pressure or intimidation could force a crack that didn't exist. They weren't just facing someone unbroken. They were facing someone refined, and the clarity and resilience that came with that refinement left them panicked, scrambling, and fully exposed. Number 10. They realized you're not chasing validation, you're building legacy. What threw them into chaos wasn't your confidence or your accomplishments. It was the quiet realization that everything you were doing had nothing to do with their approval. They had spent so long thinking they held influence over you that their opinions, judgments, and manipulations could shape your actions. They assumed you were performing, competing, or bending to be seen, liked, or accepted. Then they discovered the truth. You weren't chasing anyone's validation. You were building something far bigger, something lasting, something independent, something untouchable. They began to panic because they realized that their presence, their games, and their attempts to control the narrative were irrelevant. Their influence didn't matter. You didn't need their approval to succeed, or their attention to feel powerful. While they were fixated on trying to pull you into their drama, you were quietly constructing a life that couldn't be shaken by gossip, manipulation, or fleeting opinion. Every move you made, every decision you took, and every opportunity you seized was about growth and legacy, not about proving yourself to anyone. The meltdown came when they started noticing that their usual tactics, flattery, intimidation, comparison, and subtle sabotage, didn't work anymore. You weren't reacting, you weren't pleading, you weren't competing in the arenas they expected. Instead, you were investing in long-term results that spoke louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. That realization left them unbalanced because they thrive in chaos, drama, and control, and you had removed yourself from their system entirely. What made it even more frustrating for them was the quiet efficiency of it. You weren't loud, you weren't confrontational, you weren't desperate for recognition. Your progress, your influence, and your reputation were growing under the radar, in places they couldn't reach, and on terms they couldn't dictate. Watching someone thrive without needing anyone's approval is disorienting. It exposes their insecurity and highlights how much of their power depended on others' dependence. They discovered that your life isn't built to impress, it's built to last. And that truth is terrifying when all they ever knew was control. Number 11. They found out you can walk away without burning bridges, and that scares manipulators. The thing that sent them into a spiral wasn't that you left, it was the way you left. Clean, composed, and without drama. They had assumed that leaving a toxic situation, cutting ties, or asserting boundaries would come with anger, chaos, or some form of emotional explosion. That's how they measure strength, by how much someone reacts under pressure. But when they realized you could step away calmly without turning it into a battle, it completely destabilized them. The quiet authority in your exit revealed a truth they couldn't face. You didn't need them, and you didn't need to prove anything. They had invested in keeping you close, in manipulating outcomes, and in fostering dependence. They relied on the fear that leaving would come at a cost, that you'd be entangled, compromised, or desperate. Instead, you walked away with clarity and dignity, leaving no chaos in your wake. That kind of control is terrifying to someone who has thrived on emotional leverage because it exposes the limits of their influence. Suddenly, their games, their intimidation, and their manipulations became irrelevant. What escalated their meltdown was seeing that their absence didn't affect you in the ways they expected. You didn't lash out, you didn't retaliate, and you didn't crumble. Instead, you continued building your life, your influence, and your stability. The contrast between their desperation and your composed independence was undeniable. It highlighted how much of their perceived power depended on your reaction, and the fact that there was none left them panicked and exposed. Manipulators fear what they cannot control, and walking away cleanly, without bitterness, without public drama, without creating collateral damage, is one of the most disarming acts someone can do. It shows that your strength doesn't depend on proving a point, punishing them, or drawing attention to yourself. It exists quietly, steadily, and untouchably. That realization leaves them scrambling, grasping at influence they no longer have, and watching you thrive while they flounder, completely out of their depth. Your calm exit shattered the illusion that they could hold you, and that truth is something they can never recover from. Number 12, they discovered your presence triggers self-reflection they've been avoiding. What unsettled them more than anything wasn't your actions, your words, or even your success. It was the subtle, undeniable effect you have on people around you, the way your presence forces them to confront truths about themselves they've been avoiding for years. They didn't realize that being near you meant looking at the gaps in their own character, the compromises they've made, and the insecurities they've hidden behind confidence or control. And that kind of exposure doesn't feel like admiration. It feels like threat, because it's impossible to manipulate or spin away the discomfort it creates. They assumed that your influence was limited to what you said or did. They believed that your energy, your integrity, and your composure wouldn't have a direct impact on them. Then it hit them. They were holding up mirrors they didn't want to look into. Every time they tried to assert dominance, manipulate, or diminish you, they were reminded of their own failures, hypocrisy, and the ways they had compromised their values. Your existence highlighted what they had ignored, denied, or hidden. And seeing it reflected back in your calm, confident, and consistent presence was unbearable for them. That's why their reactions escalated. They began snapping at others, creating chaos where none existed, and lashing out over things that didn't matter, because the true source of discomfort was staring them in the mirror, and they couldn't control it. Your quiet presence doesn't demand confrontation, yet it exposes weaknesses in ways they can't escape. It forces introspection without asking for it, and that is profoundly threatening to someone used to avoiding responsibility or self-awareness. The power in this dynamic is subtle but devastating. You don't need to accuse, argue, or correct anyone. Your consistency, your strength, and the mere fact that you operate with clarity and integrity automatically force them to recognize what they aren't. That recognition is the kind of disruption that sends manipulators into overdrive, scrambling to regain a sense of control. And the more they struggle, the clearer it becomes. Your presence alone exposes the cracks in their character, and there's nothing they can do to change it. Number 13, they realized you're no longer accessible to emotional hooks. What shook them to the core wasn't that you ignored their attempts at manipulation. It was that nothing they did could touch you emotionally anymore. Every tactic they relied on, guilt, fear, flattery, intimidation, or subtle sabotage, that once had a predictable effect now bounced off you like water off steel. They had built their influence around your reactions, your vulnerabilities, the way you could be swayed or provoked. And now, for the first time, they realized their tools were useless. That realization is disorienting, even terrifying, because it strips away the illusion of control they had taken for granted. They had assumed that they could provoke anger, fear, or desperation in you, that you would give them something to work with. But over time, you cultivated an emotional independence they couldn't measure, control, or anticipate. Your reactions became deliberate, your composure consistent, and your awareness of their tactics unshakable. They could no longer predict your behavior, and that unpredictability caused a cascading panic. They were used to seeing results from their manipulation. Now, every attempt failed, and each failure magnified their frustration and insecurity. The meltdown began as they scrambled to find ways to regain influence, lashing out at anyone within reach, overcompensating, and making reckless decisions. Their emotional strategies, which once held weight, now only exposed them as desperate and irrational. You weren't participating in their games, reacting to their provocations, or feeding their ego. By removing yourself from their sphere of emotional influence, you not only protected yourself, but highlighted the fragility of their control. The most unsettling truth for them is simple. Someone who isn't emotionally accessible cannot be manipulated, cornered, or weaponized. They realized that no amount of pressure, drama, or strategy would force a response they could exploit. Your independence became a mirror reflecting their instability and obsession, and that reflection drove them into chaos. In that moment, they weren't just frustrated. They were exposed, powerless, and panicking because the person they once thought they controlled had transcended the reach of their emotional hooks entirely. Number 14. They found out your future doesn't require their absence. It survives it. The moment they truly lost, it wasn't about what you were doing in the present. It was the realization that your life, your trajectory, and your purpose don't depend on anyone who tried to hold you back. They had assumed that their absence, their sabotage, or their neglect would leave a mark, create a void, or delay your progress. Then they discovered the uncomfortable truth. You don't need them, you never did, and your future unfolds with or without their presence. That truth doesn't just frustrate, it terrifies anyone who believed they were essential to your journey. They had spent years cultivating influence, control, and emotional leverage, thinking that removing themselves or creating distance would destabilize you. They assumed absence would weaken you, that obstacles they imposed would hold you back. Instead, your absence of dependency exposed the limits of their power. Every plan they had to slow you, every attempt to manipulate outcomes, every expectation that you would be affected by their choices fell apart. Your growth isn't conditional, and your future isn't negotiable. The meltdown came from the sudden awareness that nothing they do can redirect the course you've set. They start scrambling, lashing out, and projecting frustration because the structure they built around you, the one that suggested they were central, no longer exists. You are thriving in spaces they cannot enter, achieving milestones they cannot touch, and building a life that doesn't pause for anyone's presence or absence. Their panic isn't just about control, it's about the loss of relevance. They realize their perceived importance was always an illusion, and now that illusion is shattered beyond repair. What unsettles them most is that you move forward without noise, without chaos, and without needing validation. Your path is intact, independent, and unstoppable. They cannot derail it, influence it, or catch up to it. That realization leaves them exposed, scrambling, and spiraling, because they finally understand that they were never essential to your story. Your future doesn't need their permission, their presence, or their approval. It survives them entirely, and that truth is a blow they never saw coming. What we've uncovered here is more than just a series of revelations. It's a roadmap of power, resilience, and unshakable truth. Every point, every insight, shows one undeniable reality. The people who tried to control, manipulate, or underestimate you are crashing because they mistook appearances for reality. They thought they could dictate your story, influence your choices, or limit your growth. But what they discovered instead is that your strength isn't loud, your influence isn't conditional, and your progress doesn't rely on their presence. You are unbending, unshakable, and unstoppable, a force that doesn't need approval, validation, or revenge to move forward. From the quiet refinement of your character under pressure, to the way you heal without their permission, to the fact that your legacy and future are completely independent of them, every single aspect of your life has exposed their weaknesses and insecurities. You hold control not by force or chaos, but by consistency, wisdom, and presence. You are untouchable, not because you are untouchable by circumstance, but because you understand your own value, your own power, and the inevitable unfolding of your path. And that is what makes them spaz out, what makes them lash, and what makes them panic. They can see it, feel it, and yet they cannot stop it. The lesson is clear. Nothing they do, say, or try to manipulate can hold back someone who understands themselves fully and operates from truth. Your growth, your influence, and your life are yours alone. They can attempt to interfere, but the moment they realize you are untethered from their control is the moment they crash. They are reacting not to you, but to their own inadequacy being exposed in the wake of your quiet, unstoppable power. If this message resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future insights that reveal the deeper truths about power, control, and resilience. Like this video to support the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences, and share it with someone who needs to see this today. Every action you take here helps spread awareness, strength, and clarity. Stay unshakable, stay sovereign, and remember, your journey is entirely yours, and nothing can stop it. God bless you.